So looking at things at a high level in SharePoint, really it's just an ASP.NET application that runs on IIS, or Internet Information Server. And it stores its content using both the Windows file system and Microsoft SQL Server. SQL Server is used to hold both configuration and content, but SharePoint has several template files, lots of XML files, lots of web pages, ASPX, ASCX, those type of files that get stored on the file system, just like a regular web application when you go to request a page. It's just that in SharePoint, a lot of the rendering of that page comes from content from the either the configuration database or the content database. Most environments, you're going to have a one or more web front-end servers, and then you'll have also, you may have one or more application servers. So the application servers might be running things like search, with doing the indexing and the crawling of your content, and then obviously your database, your SQL server, that's going to be typically like a clustered SQL server that has failover capabilities. The web front end that's where the actual web applications are getting hosted. So when you click on a website in your browser and you browse to a site, then you're actually going to one of those web front ends. And the application services, again, you could have more than one of those. So for example, if you have maybe you have some large jobs that need to be run, you could run it on your application services server. So looking at this setup, this architecture, we have IIS with ASP.NET on it, because ASP.NET is built to run on IIS. And then SharePoint actually runs on top of ASP.NET. And so SharePoint, you can see the web pages or some of the user controls that it has can be stored in the file system. And there's also some configuration files like the web.config, or even a lot of the features and the schema for some of the lists can actually live in the file system. And then content and other types of configuration live in the database server. So understanding where SharePoint reads this information from is helpful when you are approaching SharePoint from a development perspective, because eventually you're going to need to deploy your own content, and you need to understand what happens when the deployment job runs. So for example, we were talking, as I was saying before, some resources are always going to come from the file system, like the core list definitions, application pages, some of the core user controls, and there is more. But there is some content that's always going to come from the content database. So anything that's in a list, any documents, that's always going to come from the content database. And then sometimes it depends on the state of the resource. So when I say that, there's a term that has been around for a while, since SharePoint 2007, and that term is ghosting or customization. So there are some types of artifacts in SharePoint, like for example a master page, that they start out living on the file system, but then say a user opens SharePoint Designer and modifies the master page and saves it, then that's considered to be customized content at that point. And at that point, that master page is pulled out and sucked into the SharePoint content database. And so although the file is still on the file system, for that particular site where the master page was modified, SharePoint knows that it was modified and says, oh, when a request comes in, it says, oh, I know this has been customized, so I'm not going to pull the version from the file system anymore. I'm going to go get the master page from the database. And so you have to be careful with that, because some scenarios where you have thousands of users and maybe you have hundreds of servers, that might not be a good thing scalability-wise. You may want that to come from the file system, because it's going to be a lot faster, because the traffic back and forth from the database, although SharePoint can do some caching of its own with content from the database, it's better that it's not coming from the content database. It's a design choice that you have to make. Sometimes it's better to let users have that control. Sometimes it's not. So in this demo, we're going to take a look at the files that are in SharePoint, and we're going to actually take a look at one of the master page files and modify it. So we're going to add a toolbar on our SharePoint development server here. And we're going to add a folder, and we want it to point to the system files on SharePoint. So the files that we were just talking about, they live in a special place in SharePoint, and there's a special name for them. So it's C program files, common files, Microsoft shared, and then down to web server extensions, and then SharePoint 2010, this used to be called 12, now it's 15. Oh, I'm sorry, it used to be called 14 for SharePoint 2010. Now it's the 15 hive. So this is actually called a hive. So we're going to select that. And so now we have a new folder here. It's called you can see it says 15. So now we can get to this stuff really easily. So we can go ahead and I'm going to go into the template folder here, and I'll browse to let's go to global, and let's just open up global. So this particular system folder here has the master pages. So these are living on the file system, and these are what get read every time a page is run. In fact, SharePoint doesn't actually read the file system every time. It does cache it, but if you were to modify one of these through SharePoint Designer, like we'll see, then you'll see what happens. It will no longer read from the file system. So right now, the current master page that's being used is Seattle.master. That's the default, Seattle.master. The old version was v4.master. That was for SharePoint 2010. So let's open this. I'm going to open this with Notepad, and I'm going to modify it. I'm going to go into the body, and I'm just going to add a tag. Let's put an H1 tag. Let's say hello from file system. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to save this. I'm going to save a copy of it. This is something you don't ever really want to do. This is just for demonstration purposes, because these are system files. You don't want to be changing. You never want to change a system file in SharePoint. You always want to add to it, but never change an existing system file. But for demo purposes, that's what we're going to do here. Okay, so you can see we need to open up the website here. So we're going to render, and notice how nothing showed up yet. That's because SharePoint has this cached. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I need to flush that cache out. So I'm going to go to command prompt. I'm going to run as administrator, and I'm going to type is reset so it can stop and restart all the application pools. So this is going to clear that out. So it's going to force SharePoint to read that again. And I'm going to go ahead and just tell SharePoint to open this page. So that looks like it got started. Okay, so we should be able to open the browser window now and see this change, but the Internet Explorer browser is probably going to be caching the old copy of that. So just in case, just to make sure, I install a tool called Fiddler. So we're going to open up Fiddler. And Fiddler just has a nice handy command on it to clear the cache. So I'm going to click clear cache. So that's going to clear out all my browser cache. In fact, I'll just click it again just to make sure. So I cleared my browser cache. So now when I open up a site, we should see the change that we just made. And in fact, we do. Here's the change that we just made. We modified the master page on the file system. In a production environment, you'll never ever want to do that, but this is just for demonstration purposes. So that's doing it from the file system. So now I'm going to go ahead and we're going to open up SharePoint Designer. And we're going to connect to our site. So SharePoint Designer is calling all the web services in SharePoint to get all the metadata it needs to know about our site. So I'm going to go to Master Pages, and Seattle.master is the one that we're interested in. That's the one we've been modifying. So click on that, load that up. Now I'm going to click Edit File. And I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to replace this. I'm going to say hello from SharePoint Designer. And I'm going to save that. Now notice the dialog that's coming up here. It says, saving your changes will customize this page so that it is no longer based on the site definition. Do you want to continue? Yes, we are going to. This is, in typical situations, most large deployments, you don't want to do this kind of stuff, but again, it's a design decision that you can make. What this means is that as soon as I click yes, the content for this master page is always going to have to come out of the content database instead of the file system. So I'm going to click yes. Okay, now I'm going to go back to Fiddler, and I'm going to delete my cache, and I'm going to open up IE, and I'm going to refresh this. Well, actually, I'm going to close IE. I'm going to clear my cache again. So you need to have all instances of IE closed when you do that. Now I'm going to open it up, and now we can see hello from SharePoint Designer. So the difference now is that this is coming from the content database. And to prove that, let's go back into Global. We'll go open up Seattle Master. And if we open this with Notepad, let's go back to where we added that tag. And notice how it still says hello from file system. Because right now, this page just got sucked into the content database, and so it's no longer using the file from the file system anymore. So that last demo we did, our farm now contains a customized master page, and which has a global effect on all the sites in our farm. This is a really bad practice. In fact, if somebody did this in your organization and they were claiming to be a SharePoint expert, they probably wouldn't be around. It's not a good thing to do. You should never ever edit any of the files that SharePoint installs. You can add new files, you can add new folders and files, and that's the best practice, but never edit anything that SharePoint installs. Never ever make customizations directly in those files. You should be using solution packages. So what that means is if we wanted to make a change in the master page, what we would have done is we basically would have created a new master page. And if we wanted everything that the old master page we would basically just copy the old master page into a new file and then add our new content and give it a new name. And then we would deploy that with a solution package. And by deploying it with a solution package, that means that when SharePoint deploys it, it's going to push that new master file page, or the new master page file out to all the web front-end servers. So that way, when users go to access a page and it's using that master page, it'll still keep grabbing it from the file system because of using the solution package, that deployment framework. And when you deploy your solution packages, SharePoint knows how to keep the servers in the farm in sync, so it knows how to deploy those packages to all the other servers in your farm. It takes care of that for you. All you do is just you deploy on one of the web front-end servers, or could be the central admin server. You deploy your solution package, and SharePoint will take care of the rest. SharePoint Designer-based customizations like we did, that could also be dangerous. The way it could be dangerous is you could actually use inline code blocks. So you could actually use, you could reference some ASP.NET controls and put those on there. And those controls might not be approved by SharePoint. So SharePoint has limits in the pages. So one of the limits is it doesn't allow you to put more than a set number of controls on a page for protecting the performance of the SharePoint farm. This is controlled through configuration. So in the web.config files where that is designated. And then also SharePoint provides safety. So every single control that is executed on a SharePoint page, it has to already be deemed as a safe control. So that's called safe mode processing. So if you were to create a web part and put a web part on a page, it wasn't added as a safe control, then you would get an error on that page saying, oh, sorry, this particular control has not been, is unsafe. It's not on the list. So let's go ahead now and we'll take a look at how safe mode processing works inside SharePoint. So we're back in the Seattle.master page, and we have it open up in SharePoint Designer. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove this hello from SharePoint Designer, and I'm going to add a label and give it an ID. Let's call it label 1. We'll tell it to run at server, typical ASP.NET control. And actually, I'm going to give it text, just some default text. We'll just say label. So that's fine, nothing wrong with that. And let's just go ahead and run that, and you can see up here, here's our label that we just added. Nothing wrong with that. That control is considered to be safe. We can use that. So now I'm going to add a script block, though. We're going to do some inline code. So we'll override or add the page load event. And what we're going to do is just override the text property of our label. Oops. I'll save that. Okay, and so now when I try to run this page, so I hit Control S to save the page, and I get the typical SharePoint error page because that inline code isn't allowed in SharePoint. So if we want to, we could add that. So I'm going to go and let's go to IIS. Oops. I'm going to go in and I'm just trying to browse to the web config for our site. So we're in SharePoint 80 as our web application. This is just a convenient way to make sure you go into the right web config file. So I'm going to explore this. And here's our web config file. So I'm going to open that up. It's going to open in Visual Studio. So as soon as this opens up, I'm going to do a search for page parser paths. And here it is. Okay, we're going to add a path. We're going to say anywhere from the root of this site on down, and we'll include subfolders. Oops, and we'll say compilation mode. Always. And most important part, allow server-side script. Again, this is not a best practice, but this is just demonstrating the capabilities of SharePoint of safe processing. Okay, so that should be all we need here. I'm going to go ahead and save the web config file. Now I'm going to go back and refresh our page. When I modify the web config file, that actually reset the application pool. SharePoint has a, or actually that's part of ASP.NET, it has a listener on that file, and so when it gets changed, then IIS application pool is reset. So that's why it's taken a little bit longer to render this page, because it's like the first time accessing the site again. And so you can see we have our code showing up now. Hello from inline code in SharePoint Designer. So now I'm going to go back to SharePoint Designer, and I'm going to add another control here. I'm going to add a ASP XML data source. And tell it to run that server. Save that. So it just saved it, and now we're going to run this page again. So I'll just refresh the page. And we get an error again. And it's because that particular controlled XML data source is not allowed on the page. Because the reason being that the type XML data source from System Web could not be found. Well, we know it was found, but it has not been registered as safe. So I'm going to go back to the web config file, and notice how we have this safe control section here. I'm going to find that. And I found it. Here's my XML data source control, and notice how it was set to be false. I'm going to set that to true. Save that. I should be able to refresh my page. It's going to take a long time again because it's resetting the application pool. But now I've marked this control as safe, so SharePoint should allow it to be on that page. And you can see it does work now. So now we're not getting the error, we're getting the regular page. So in SharePoint, any solutions that we deploy to the SharePoint root, so that 15 Hive, those are called farm solutions. And farm solutions require admin access to the farm. And in hosted and governed environments, this is a problem. So for example, if you're using SharePoint Online and you try to develop a solution package and you want to deploy it as a farm solution, you're not going to be able to. And it makes perfect sense because it's a multi-tenant run SharePoint farm for millions and millions of people, and so Microsoft cannot afford for that to go down by somebody deploying code to their servers that may do something bad. And so, and in fact, a lot of there are some administrators and some companies that won't allow people to deploy any solutions on their farms either. It all depends on where you're at. But what you can do is you can do a sandbox solution. Sandbox solutions are at the site collection level, so it's not fully trusted code. So it'll run inside the Microsoft SharePoint Foundation Sandbox code service. That allows everything to be run in safe mode, and the administrator of the site collection can actually turn it on or turn it off if they want. And there's different rules that can be used to govern that sandbox solution. And then obviously in SharePoint 2013 is the new app model where you can build an app and that app can run completely off of the SharePoint server. But sandbox solutions are still viable. They're still used if you things like saving list as a template that creates a solution file, and that's actually a sandbox solution. If you just want to deploy a new list or any type of provisioning for lists, or just maybe some files, some content, and an app is kind of overkill. You don't need to do that. You could still use a sandbox solution, and even though you are not going to have any code executing, you can provision things that you need to get provisioned. Although you can still have executing code in the sandbox as well, you just cannot elevate permissions of a user. So you can't touch system files in a sandbox solution, whereas in a farm solution, you can. And there's some things you can't do in sandbox solutions, like you can't use user controls, obviously, because they get loaded from that 15 Hive. So anything that comes from the 15 Hive that you're trying to deploy to with a sandbox solution, you're not going to be able to do it. But these are some alternatives.